I still remember the exact moment everything changed. The moment when a simple load of laundry transformed me from an invisible domestic worker into someone caught in the shadows of the Cold War. And I need to tell you this story, because what I discovered that Tuesday morning in February 1985 wasn't just hidden money. It was evidence of conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. And the choice I made in the hours that followed would either save lives or destroy my own. But before I explain what I found sewn into that winter coat, you need to understand who I was back then. Just Maria Castellanos, a 42-year-old widow from El Salvador who cleaned houses in Georgetown to send money back to my sister and her children. Invisible to the wealthy families I worked for, another brown-skinned woman with rough hands who scrubbed their toilets and washed their expensive clothes. And that invisibility, that complete lack of attention they paid to me, that's exactly what made me dangerous to them. Because when you're invisible, people forget you have eyes and ears. They forget you're even human sometimes. And Mr. Volkov, or whatever his real name was, he made that fatal mistake. He saw me as furniture, as a non-person who simply appeared 3 times a week to make his townhouse spotless. And I'd been working for him for almost 8 months by that point. This tall, thin man with pale blue eyes who claimed to be a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy. Always polite, always correct. Speaking English with that thick accent that made every word sound like it was wrapped in ice, and I'd learned not to ask questions in my line of work. Learned that wealthy people value discretion above everything else, that they paid well for silence and for the ability to pretend their hired help didn't notice anything unusual. But how could I not notice the strange things happening in that house? The visitors who came after midnight, the phone calls he'd take, in rapid Russian while pacing in his study, the way he'd tense up whenever I needed to clean certain rooms, especially that locked office on the 2nd floor that I was only permitted to dust and vacuum when he was present, watching my every move like I might suddenly sprout wings and fly away with his secrets. And on this particular morning, he'd left in a hurry. Some emergency meeting he'd mentioned the day before, telling me he wouldn't be home until evening and to please make sure to finish all the laundry because he was traveling to New York that weekend. And I'd nodded like I always did, agreeing to everything because that's what good help does. We agree and we fade into background and we do our jobs. So I gathered all the clothes in the hampers, sorted them by color and fabric like I'd done 1,000 times before, and I was checking pockets because you'd be amazed what people leave in their pockets. Coins and receipts, and sometimes even cash that they'd forgotten about. And I'd learned to always check because once I'd accidentally washed a passport and had to spend an hour with a hairdryer trying to save it. So checking pockets had become automatic muscle memory, my fingers sliding into each pocket before clothes went into machine, and that's when I felt it in his heavy winter coat. This bulge in a lining that shouldn't have been there, not a normal pocket, but something sewn into the fabric itself, hidden, and my first thought was maybe it's just the coat's construction. Maybe that's how expensive coats are made. But something made me pause, some instinct that came from years of handling clothes and knowing when something wasn't right. So I ran my fingers along the lining more carefully, and I could feel it. Rectangular shapes, multiple objects creating small bumps in the fabric. And I knew I should stop, knew I should just wash the coat and pretend I felt nothing, because curiosity had gotten other maids fired, had gotten them blacklisted from the best houses in Georgetown. But my fingers were already finding the loose stitching at the bottom of the lining, already pulling gently at the thread, and the gap opened up like a mouth revealing secrets. And I reached inside and pulled out the first bundle. And even before I fully saw what it was, I knew this wasn't innocent. Knew that whatever I was holding was going to complicate my simple life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. And when I unfolded the cloth, wrapping my breath caught in my throat because I was looking at Soviet rubles, stacks of them bound with rubber bands. Currency that had no legitimate reason to be hidden in a coat in Washington, D.C. And the question started flooding my mind. Why would a cultural attaché need to hide Soviet money in his coat lining? Why not just keep it in a drawer or safe? Why sew it into the fabric unless he needed to move it secretly? Unless he was afraid of being searched? Unless this money was connected to something illegal, something dangerous? And I should tell you that I wasn't naive. I'd lived through a civil war in El Salvador. I'd seen what happened when you got involved in things that weren't your business. I'd lost my husband because he'd asked the wrong questions to the wrong people. So every survival instinct I had was screaming at me, put the money back. Sew up the lining, wash the coat, and forget I'd ever seen anything. But I couldn't stop thinking about all the other strange things I'd noticed over the months The way Mr. Volkov had reacted when I'd accidentally picked up a folder from his desk, how he'd practically lunged across the room to snatch it from my hands, or the time I'd heard him on the phone talking about the package in the drop site in English, switching to Russian mid-sentence when he realized I was in the hallway, or the visitor I'd seen once, a nervous American man in an expensive suit who'd looked terrified, sitting in the living room at dawn when I'd arrived early, and I greeted them and the American would stare at me with these wide, panicked eyes like I was death itself walking through the door. And now here I was holding evidence of something. I didn't know exactly what, but something that felt heavy with consequence. Something that made my hand shake as I stood there in that laundry room with a washing machine humming beside me and Soviet rubles spread across the folding table. And I want you to understand the weight of that moment, because I had to make a choice that would define everything that came after. I could protect myself and my family by staying silent, by being an invisible maid who saw nothing and knew nothing, or I could risk everything by speaking up, by admitting that I've been paying attention all along, that I've been watching and listening and connecting dots that maybe I wasn't supposed to connect, and the thing that ultimately pushed me toward the phone, toward that decision that would unravel my entire life, was remembering something my husband used to say before they killed him. He used to say that evil flourishes when good people choose comfort over courage, when they see wrong and decide it's not their problem. And I've been comfortable in my invisibility for so long, comfortable in my silence. But standing there with that evidence in my hands, I realized that some things are bigger than personal safety. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep. And what if this man was betraying the country that had given me refuge? What if this money was being used to hurt people? What if my silence made me complicit in something terrible? And I know you're probably wondering what I did next, whether I made the call or whether I chose a safer path. And I promise I'll tell you everything, every detail of what happened when I finally picked up that phone and dialed the number I'd seen on a poster at the post. Office, the FBI hotline for reporting suspicious activity. But first you need to understand what that call cost me, what it meant to go from invisible to visible, from anonymous to exposed. Because the moment I spoke to that agent, everything changed, and the consequences of that choice are still rippling through my life today, 40 years later. And this story, this true story of espionage and moral choice and one woman's decision to step out of the shadows, it's important not just because of what it reveals about Cold War spies operating in our nation's capital, but because it asks a question that every one of us has to answer at some point in our lives. What would you do if you stumbled on evidence of something wrong, something dangerous? Would you speak up knowing it might destroy your life? Or would you stay silent and safe? And I can't answer that question for you, but I can tell you what I did and what happened because of it. So stay with me, because what comes next is a cascade of surveillance and interrogations and danger that I never could have imagined. A story where one hidden bundle of Soviet rubles led to the exposure of an entire spy network, and my role in stopping them. But also what it took from me, what I lost, and whether in the end it was worth it. The rubles were just the beginning. Just the first crack of facade that I've been staring at for 8 months without realizing it was a facade at all. And once I saw that crack, everything else started to make sense in a way that terrified me. Because suddenly all those little moments I dismissed or ignored or explained away came rushing back with new meaning, darker meaning. And I found myself standing in that laundry room, not moving, just thinking, just remembering, and the memories arranged themselves like puzzle pieces that have been scattered across months, finally forming a coherent picture. And that picture showed me something I've been too blind or too frightened or too focused on my own survival to see. That the man I worked for wasn't a cultural attaché at all. He was something much more dangerous. And I've been cleaning his safe house, washing his clothes, making his bed, existing in the intimate spaces of his double life, while he conducted espionage right in front of my invisible eyes. And I need you to understand how the pattern emerged, because it wasn't obvious at first. It never is. Spies don't announce themselves. They blend in, they create routines that seem normal until you look at them from a different angle. And that's what I was doing now. Looking at everything from this new terrible angle where hidden rubles made sense, where all the strangeness I'd witnessed suddenly had an explanation. And the first thing I remembered was the visitors, because Mr. Volkov had visitors at the strangest times. Not during normal social hours, but at 2 a.m. at dawn, late on Sunday afternoons when normal diplomats would be relaxing, and these weren't cocktail parties or dinner guests. These were always single individuals who arrived looking nervous, looking around like they expected to be followed, and I'd usually only catch glimpses of them because Mr. Volkov would schedule my cleaning times carefully, but occasionally I'd arrive early or need to come back for something I'd forgotten. And that's when I'd see them, these Americans in business suits or casual clothes who didn't look like the kind of people who'd socialize with a Soviet diplomat. They looked wrong, somehow out of place. And their body language was all wrong too, hunch and furtive. And I remember one man in particular, this middle-aged guy with gray hair and an expensive watch who I'd seen 3 times over several months. Always arriving after dark. Always staying less than an hour. And the last time I saw him, he looked sick, actually physically ill. His face was pale and sweaty, and when I'd walk past in the hallway, he'd grip my arm. This stranger had grabbed me and looked into my eyes, and I could see something desperate there, something pleading. But then Mr. Volkov had appeared and said something sharp in Russian, and the man had let go and hurried past me. And I thought at the time that maybe he was sick, maybe he had the flu or food poisoning. But now, standing here with Soviet rubles in my hands, I understood that what I'd seen on his face wasn't physical illness. It was fear. It was the look of a man who'd gotten himself into something he couldn't get out of, a man who was trapped. And was he one of them? Was he passing secrets to Mr. Volkov? Was that why he looked so terrified? And then there were the phone calls, God. The phone calls that I tried so hard not to listen to, because eavesdropping could get you fired. But you can't. Unhear things. You can't unknow what you've accidentally learned. And Mr. Volkov spent hours on the phone speaking rapid Russian that I couldn't understand, but sometimes he'd speak English. And I remember specific phrases now that seemed innocuous at the time, but now drip with menace. Phrases like, the package is ready for collection, and our friend at the agency confirms. And once, just once, I'd heard him say, if he doesn't cooperate, we'll have to use the photographs. And I'd been vacuuming in the hallway when he said it. And he hadn't known I was there, and the coldness in his voice when he said the photographs made my blood freeze because I understood blackmail. Everyone understands blackmail. It's universal. And was he blackmailing Americans into giving him secrets? Was that what this was? I thought about that terrified man with the expensive watch and wondered what photographs they had of him, what they were using to force him to betray his country. And then there was the office. That locked second-floor office that I was barely allowed to enter. And even when I did enter, it was always with Mr. Volkov standing right there watching me, literally standing in the doorway, watching every move I made. And I was only permitted to vacuum the center of the room and dust the surfaces, never allowed to touch the filing cabinets or the desk drawers or move any of the papers. And once I'd reached toward a folder on his desk, not try to read it, just trying to move it so I could dust underneath. And he'd crossed the room so fast I'd actually jumped, and he'd taken a folder from my hands with this tight smile and said, "Please, Maria, these are confidential embassy documents. Very boring, but very sensitive." And his tone had been pleasant, but his eyes were cold, warning me, and I'd apologize and step back and never try to touch his papers again. But I'd seen things anyway, because you can't help but see things when you're cleaning. Your eyes register everything even when you're not trying to look. And I'd seen maps of Washington spread across his desk with certain buildings circled in red. And I'd seen photographs of people I didn't recognize, surveillance photos taken from a distance with telephoto lenses. And I'd seen documents with Cyrillic writing that I couldn't read, but that were stamped with official-looking seals. And once, just for a second, I'd seen what looked like blueprints, technical drawings of something mechanical or electronic. And I'd only glimpsed it before he'd covered it with another paper, but I'd seen enough to know it wasn't cultural attaché work. Culture doesn't require blueprints, and there were the disguises, which I hadn't understood at the time, but now made perfect sense, because I'd found wigs in his closet, several of them different colors and styles, and I'd found glasses with thick frames and what looked like a fake mustache, and I'd assumed maybe they were for costume parties or theater. Diplomats did cultural things like theater, but now I understood they were for surveillance, for meeting his contacts without being recognized, for moving to the city as someone else. And I remember the time I'd arrived early and seen him coming down the stairs wearing one of those wigs, brown instead of his normal blonde, and he looked startled to see me and quickly pulled it off and laughed and said something about practicing for a diplomatic function. And I'd laughed too, because what else do you do when your employer catches you catching him in a wig? But that laugh felt sick in my memory now. Felt like complicity, like I'd been helping him maintain his cover by pretending not to notice. And then there was the money, not just the rubles I'd found, but the cash I'd seen him handling. Thick envelopes of American $100 bills that he'd count at his desk. And I'd always assumed it was embassy money, operational funds or something. But why? Would a cultural attaché need to count thousands of dollars in cash in his home? Why not do that at the embassy where it would be secure? Unless this was money for paying informants, for buying secrets, for bribing people into treason. And I thought about that terrified man again and wonder how much he'd been paid, whether the money made it easier or harder to live with what he was doing. And there were the late-night departures, too, times when I'd arrive early in the morning and could tell, from the state of the house, that Mr. Volkov had left in the middle of the night. Coffee cup still on the counter, lights left on, and once I'd found muddy footprints leading from the back door through the kitchen. Like he'd come back through the garden instead of the front door, like he'd been somewhere he didn't want the neighbors to see him returning from. And I cleaned up those footprints without thinking much about it. But now I wonder where he'd been, what dead drop or secret meeting had required him to sneak through his own back garden at 3 a.m. And the more I remember, the more the pattern solidified. The more undeniable it became that I'd been working a spy's house, cleaning a spy's dishes, washing a spy's clothes, and the worst part, the part that made me feel sick and complicit and afraid, was that my discretion had helped him. My silence and my invisibility had been tools he'd used. Because a house that's always clean, always organized, always running smoothly, that's a house that doesn't attract attention. That's a house where neighbors think everything is normal, and I've been maintaining that normalcy for him. I'd been part of his cover story. The reliable maid who came 3 times a week meant he was legitimate, meant he was just another diplomat living a regular life. And I hadn't known. I swear I hadn't understood what I was doing. But ignorance doesn't erase complicity, does it? And standing there with the rubles in my hand, I felt the weight of all those months of unknowing cooperation. And I wondered what secrets had been passed, what damage had been done, what Americans had been compromised, while I dusted and vacuumed and smiled and stayed invisible. And the fear that gripped me then wasn't just fear for myself, wasn't just worry about what would happen if Mr. Volkov found out I discovered his money. It was bigger than that. It was a fear that comes from realizing you've been close to something dangerous without knowing it, like finding out you've been sleeping next to a bomb. And I had to decide what to do with this knowledge, this terrible, heavy knowledge that I'd stumbled into, and I knew that doing nothing was no longer an option, because now I'd seen the pattern, now I understood. And you can't unknow something like that. You can't go back to innocent ignorance once you've recognized evil for what it is. So the question wasn't whether the pattern was real. The pattern was undeniable. The question was whether I had the courage to act on what I knew, whether I could risk everything to stop something that might be hurt in my adopted country. And I stood there in that laundry room for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, holding evidence of espionage, remembering months of suspicious behavior, and trying to find the courage to make a phone call that would change everything. The phone felt impossibly heavy in my hand, heavier than it should have been, like the weight of what I was about to do had somehow transferred itself into the plastic receiver. And I stood in my tiny efficiency apartment staring at the rotary dial, trying to remember the number I'd seen on that poster at the post office, the FBI hotline number that I'd glanced at 100 times without ever thinking I'd need it. And my fingers were shaking so badly that I had to dial 3 times before I got it right. Each failed attempt making my heart pound harder, making the fear more real. And I need you to understand how terrified I was in that moment, because calling the FBI wasn't like calling a friend or making a doctor's appointment. This was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This was stepping out of invisibility into a spotlight that might burn me alive. And I'd taken the rubles with me when I left Mr. Volkov's house that morning, wrapped them back in their cloth and stuffed them in my purse, which was probably illegal, probably tampered with evidence or theft or something. But I couldn't just leave them there, couldn't sew them back into the coat lining and pretend I'd never found them. And now they sat on my kitchen table like an accusation, like proof of my decision. And the phone was ringing, that hollow electronic ringing that seemed to echo through my entire apartment, through my entire life. And I almost hung up. My thumb was actually moving toward the disconnect button when a voice answered, male, professional, saying, FBI hotline, how can I help you? And my throat closed up, just completely seized. And for several seconds I couldn't speak at all. And the voice said again, hello, is anyone there? And I forced words out, forced myself to say, I need to report something suspicious. And my accent was thicker than usual, because fear does that. Fear makes you sound more foreign, more other. And I wondered if he'd take me seriously, if a Salvadoran cleaning lady with broken English would be believed, or if he'd dismiss me as paranoid or confused. And he said, what would you like to report, ma'am? And his voice was patient, kind even, and that kindness made it easier somehow, made the words start flowing. And I said, I work as a maid for a man named Volkov. He says he works at the Soviet embassy, and I found money hidden in his coat. Soviet rubles? Lots of them. Sewn into the lining. And there was a pause, just a brief hesitation. And then his voice changed, became sharper, more focused. And he said, Can you tell me your name and location? And that's when the real fear hit, because giving my name meant becoming visible, meant stepping into their world, meant I could be found, questioned, exposed. And I thought about my sister in El Salvador and her children who depended on the money I sent every month. And I thought about Mr. Volkov's cold blue eyes and what he might do if he found out I betrayed him. And I almost said, never mind. Almost made an excuse and hung up. But instead I heard myself saying, my name is Maria Castellanos. I live in Arlington. And I gave him my address. Just said it out loud like I was signing my own death warrant. And he said, stay where you are. Someone will come to speak with you within the hour. And I wanted to say no, wanted to say I'd changed my mind, wanted to take it all back. But he'd already transferred me to someone else, another agent, and this one had. Questions, so many questions. What's the exact address where I work? How long have I worked there? What exactly did I find? Have I told anyone else? Does my employer know I took the money? And I answered everything as best I could, my English getting worse as my panic increased, stumbling over words, having to repeat myself. And the agent was patient but persistent. He wanted details, specific details. And I told him about the visitors at strange hours, about the locked office, about the phone. Conversations I'd overheard, about the wigs and disguises, about everything I remembered while standing in that laundry room. And I could hear him taking notes, could hear the scratch of his pen, and occasionally he'd ask for clarification. What did the American visitor look like? Or, can you remember any specific words from the phone conversations? And I really tried to give him useful information, but memory is slippery when you're terrified. Details blur and mix, and I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if there's an innocent explanation for everything? What if I'm about to destroy a man's life over misunderstanding? But then I'd look at the rubles on my table and know that there was no innocent explanation for money hidden in coat lining. No legitimate reason for a diplomat to hide his own country's currency. And the agent must have sensed my wavering because he said something that changed everything. He said, ma'am, if what you're telling me is accurate, you may have stumbled onto an active espionage operation, and your information could help us protect national security. And hearing him say out loud like that, hearing the words espionage operation, made it real in a way it hadn't been before, made me understand that this wasn't just about me and my fear and my safety. This was bigger. This mattered. And I thought about my husband again, about his belief that silence in the face of evil is its own kind of evil. And I straightened my spine and said, when will someone come? And the agent said very soon, and ma'am, this is important. Don't go back to that house. Don't contact your employer. Don't tell anyone about this call. And I said I wouldn't. Promise I wouldn't. And then the call was over, and I was alone in my apartment with Soviet rubles on my table and the certain knowledge that FBI agents were coming to my home. And the waiting was worse than the fear had been, worse than anything, because now I had time to think about all the ways this could go wrong. And I paced my tiny apartment, 3 steps one way, 3 steps back, unable to sit, unable to eat, my stomach churning with anxiety. And I kept going to the window and looking out at the street, expecting to see Mr. Volkov's car, expecting him to somehow know what I'd done, to come looking for his money, to come for revenge. And every car that passed made my heart jump. Every footstep in the hallway made me freeze. And I started imagining scenarios, terrible scenarios. What if the FBI didn't believe me and told Mr. Volkov that his crazy mate had accused him of being a spy? What if he had friends at the Bureau who warned him? What if I just made myself a target? And I thought about running, just grabbing the essentials and leaving, catching a bus to somewhere far away, changing my name, disappearing. But where would I go? I had no money beyond what I'd saved for my sister, had no skills beyond cleaning houses, and running would mean abandoning the only life I'd built in America, the only stability I'd found after fleeing El Salvador. And besides, I'd already given them my name and address, already committed myself to this path. And then there was a knock at my door, firm and official, and I looked through the peephole and saw 2 men in dark suits holding up badges. FBI, credentials, and this was it. This was a moment of no return, and I opened the door and they came inside. These two agents who looked exactly like you'd imagine FBI agents would look. Serious faces, observant eyes that took in every detail of my humble apartment in seconds. And the older one introduced himself as Special Agent Morrison and his partner as Agent Chun. And they sat down at my kitchen table, right there next to the rubles I'd laid out, and Agent Morrison picked up one of the bundles, examined it carefully, and said, "You did the right thing calling us Mrs. Castellanos." And I corrected him, said, "Miss, I'm a widow," and he nodded and said, "Miss Castellanos, we need you to tell us everything from the beginning, and don't leave anything out no matter how insignificant it seems." And so I told them everything I'd already told the phone agent and more, details coming back as I spoke, little moments I'd forgotten, and they listened intently, occasionally, stopping me to ask questions, and Agent Chin was writing everything down in a small notebook, his handwriting fast and precise. And when I finished, Agent Morrison leaned back in his chair and exchanged a look with his partner, a meaningful look that told me they knew something I didn't. And he said, "Miss Castellanos, the man you know as Volkov is someone we've been interested in for quite some time, but we haven't had enough evidence to move on him. What you've found and what you've observed could be exactly what we need." And I felt a strange mix of vindication and terror hearing that. Vindication that I'd been right, that my suspicions were justified, but terror at what it meant, that I'd been working for a spy the FBI was investigating, that I'd been inside his house, close to the secrets. And Agent Morrison continued, "We're going to need your help. We need you to go back to work as if nothing happened, to continue your normal routine, but we need you to be our eyes and ears inside that house." And the terror flooded through me like ice water, and I said, "No, I can't. He'll know. He'll see it in my face. I can't lie to him." And Agent Chin spoke for the first time, his voice gentler than Morrison's, and he said, "You've been lying to him for 8 months by staying invisible, by not reacting to all the things you've seen. You can do this. We'll help you. We'll prepare you." And I wanted to refuse, wanted to say absolutely not, find someone else. But Agent Morrison played his trump card. He said, "If you don't help us, if we can't build a case with your testimony and cooperation, Volkov will continue operating. We'll continue recruiting Americans to betray their country. We'll continue until we catch him in the act or until he gets recalled to Moscow. And every day he operates is another day of damage to national security." And I knew he was manipulating me, knew he was using patriotism and guilt to get what he wanted. But he was also right, wasn't he? Because if I walked away now, if I refused to help, then what was the point of making that phone call? What was the point of taking the risk I'd already taken? And my husband's voice was in my head again, saying that evil flourishes when good people do nothing. And I looked at these two FBI agents sitting in my kitchen asking me to become a spy myself, asking me to go back into that house and pretend everything was normal while watching and reporting and helping them build their case. And every survival instinct I had was screaming no, screaming run, screaming protect yourself. But there was another voice too, quieter but insistent, asking what kind of person I wanted to be, whether I could live with myself if I walked away now. And the silence stretched out while they waited for my answer, while I wrestled with fear and duty and the terrible weight of consequence. And finally, in a voice that didn't sound like my own, I heard myself say, "What do you need me to do?" And Agent Morrison smiled, not a warm smile, but a satisfied one. And he said, "First, we need you to tell us everything about tomorrow's schedule, when you're supposed to work next, what your normal routine is." And just like that, I wasn't just Maria Castellanos, the cleaning lady, anymore. I was Maria Castellanos, the confidential informant. And my life as I'd known was over, and what came next would test every ounce of courage I had, would put me in danger I couldn't fully comprehend, would require me to walk back into that house and face those cold blue eyes and pretend that nothing had changed, that I was still invisible, still silent, still safe. And I want you to stay with me, because what happened next, the surveillance operation they ran, the narrow escapes, the moment when everything nearly fell apart, that's a story of ordinary courage and extraordinary circumstances. And you need to hear how close we came to disaster, how close I came to being discovered, and what we ultimately uncovered about the network of spies operating in Washington, D.C. Because this wasn't just about one man and hidden rubles. This was about something much bigger, much more dangerous, and my role in exposing it, wow. Going back to that house the next morning was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Harder than fleeing El Salvador with nothing but a suitcase. Harder than burying my husband. harder than anything I had experienced in a life that hadn't exactly been easy, and I stood outside the townhouse at 7:45 in the morning, just like I did every Tuesday and Thursday, my key in my hand, my cleaning supplies in their canvas bag, try and control my breathing, try and make my face neutral and agent. Morrison's words kept echoing in my head. Act normal. You're just a maid. You're invisible. He doesn't see you as a threat. But I felt so visible. Felt like my guilt and fear were written across my forehead in letters 10 feet tall, and I had a wire taped to my chest. This tiny microphone that the FBI had attached to me at 5 in the morning in a van parked 3 blocks away. And they'd show me how it worked. Told me it would pick up everything as long as I stayed on the first 2 floors. And Agent Chun had looked me in the eyes and said, "You're very brave, Miss Castellanos." But I didn't feel brave. I felt like I was in a vomit, and my hand shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and the house smelled the same, coffee and expensive cologne, and that particular scent that all well-kept houses have. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself that everything was normal, that I'd imagined the whole thing, that yesterday had been some kind of fever dream. But then I saw Mr. Volkov coming down the stairs, and my heart nearly stopped because he was looking at me, really looking at me, and his pale blue eyes seemed to see right through me. And he said, "Good morning, Maria," just like he said every morning, and I managed to say, "Good morning, Mr. Volkov," and my voice sounded almost normal, just a little tight. And he said, "I'm flying to New York this afternoon. Did you finish the laundry yesterday?" And the question hit me like a punch because the laundry, the coat, the rubles I'd stolen, and I had to answer, had to say something, and the FBI had prepared me for this, had told me what to say, and I heard myself responding, "Yes, sir. Everything is clean and pressed in your closet." And he nodded, satisfied, and walked past me toward the kitchen, and I stood there trembling, wanted to run, wanted to tear the wire off my chest and flee, but instead I went to the closet where I kept my supplies and started my routine, the same routine I'd done 100 times, and the normalcy of it was surreal. I was dusting the same furniture, vacuuming the same floors, while wearing a wire and spying for the FBI, and Mr. Volkov was in his office making phone calls, and I could hear his voice, mostly Russian but occasionally English, and I made sure to vacuum near his office door, so the wire would pick up what he was saying, and I heard him say something about the delivery on Saturday and our friend is getting nervous. And I knew the FBI was listening, knew they were recording every word, and it felt powerful and terrifying at the same time. This secret knowledge that I was gathering evidence, that I mattered, that I wasn't invisible anymore even though I had to pretend to be. And this went on for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of wearing a wire. 3 weeks of reporting everything I saw to Agent Morrison and Agent Chun in their unmarked van. 3 weeks of living with constant fear that Mr. Volkov would discover what I was doing, and the FBI was watching the house too, surveillance teams in cars and apartments across the street, photographing everyone who came and went, and they showed me some photographs, asked me to identify people I'd seen, and I recognized several of them, including that terrified American man with the expensive watch. And Agent Morrison told me his name was Robert Hutchins, and he worked for the Defense Department, had access to classified information about military technology, and he'd been passing secrets to Volkov for 18 months, and they knew this because of my information, because I described him and they'd identified him and followed him, and knowing that I'd helped catch a traitor should have made me feel good, but instead it just made me feel sad. Sad for this man who'd gotten himself trapped, who'd made terrible choices and would now pay for them. And I wondered about his family, whether he had children who would grow up knowing their father was a spy. And then one Thursday morning, everything changed. Everything went wrong in ways I hadn't anticipated, because I arrived at the house and Mr. Volkov was still home, which was unusual. He was usually at the embassy by the time I arrived, but today he was there, sitting in the living room. And he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, younger, harder looking, speaking Russian. And when I walked, they both stopped talking and looked at me, and the younger man said something in Russian, and Mr. Volkov responded, also in Russian, and I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the tone, suspicious, questioning, and Mr. Volkov stood up and walked toward me and said, "Maria, how long have you been working for me?" And the question seemed innocent, but something about the way he asked it made my blood freeze. And I said, 8 months, sir." And he said, "And in those 8 months, have you ever taken anything from this house? Anything at all?" And I knew in that moment that he'd discovered the missing rubles, that he'd checked the coat lining for some reason. Maybe he'd needed the money. Maybe it was just routine, but he knew they were gone, and I had seconds to decide how to respond, whether to confess or deny, and the wire on my chest felt like it was burning, felt like it was broadcasting my guilt. And I said, "No, sir, never. I would never steal." And I put as much offended dignity into my voice as I could manage. And he studied my face for what felt like an eternity. And then he said something in Russian to the other man. And the other man walked over to me, came so close I could smell tobacco on his breath. And he looked at me with these dead eyes and said in accented English, "Maybe we should search her." And panic flooded through me, because if they searched me, they'd find the wire. They'd know I was working with the FBI. And I didn't know what they'd do to me, but nothing good, nothing survivable. And I was opening my mouth to protest when there was a knock at the door, loud and official, and a voice shouted, "FBI, we have a warrant." And everything happened so fast. The door burst open and agents flooded in, 6 or 7 of them with guns drawn. And Mr. Volkov's face went white, absolutely, bloodless. And the younger man reached inside his jacket, but 3 agents were on him before he could draw whatever weapon he was reaching for. And they pushed me aside, pushed me toward the door, and I stumbled outside, and Agent Chun was there, pulling the wire off me, asking if I was okay. And I couldn't answer because I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. And inside the house I could hear shouting Russian and English mixed together, and the sound of things being overturned, searched. And Agent Morrison came out 15 minutes later, and he looked satisfied, triumphant even, and he said, "We got him. We got everything, documents, money, a list of contacts, enough to put him away forever and roll up his entire network." And I should have felt relieved, should have felt victorious, but all I felt was exhausted and afraid. And I said, "Why did you come early? Why didn't you wait?" And he said, "We had surveillance on the house. We saw the other man arrive and recognized him as GRU, military intelligence, and we knew something was wrong, knew they might be on to you. So we moved, and I realized how close I had come to disaster, how close I had come to being discovered and disappeared. And the full weight of what I'd been doing, the risk I'd taken for 3 weeks, hit me all at once, and my knees buckled, and Agent Chin caught me, helped me sit down on the curb, and he said, "It's over now, you're safe." But I knew that wasn't entirely true, because Mr. Volkov knew my name, knew where I lived, and even if he was arrested, the Soviets had other agents, other people who might want revenge. And Agent Morrison confirmed this when he sat down next to me and said, "We're going to need to relocate you, put you in witness protection until the trial." And I stared at him, not understanding at first, and then understanding too well. He was saying I had to leave my life, leave my apartment, my job, my identity, everything I'd built in America. And I said, "For how long?" And he said, "Maybe permanently, we don't know yet. Depends on the threat assessment." And I thought about my sister in El Salvador, about how I wouldn't be able to send her money anymore, wouldn't be able to call her or write to her, would just disappear from her life. And I started crying, not dramatic sobbing, but quiet tears running down my face. And Agent Chin looked uncomfortable, and Agent Morrison looked sympathetic, but determined. And he said, "You did an incredibly brave thing. You helped us stop a serious threat to national security. And yes, there are consequences. Yes, it's going to be difficult, but you should be proud." And I wanted to ask him if pride would pay my sister's rent, if pride would feed her children, if pride would replace the life I was losing. But I was too tired to argue, too overwhelmed to fight. And so I just nodded and let them lead me to their car, let them drive me away from that house for the last time. And I watched through the window as agents carried boxes of evidence out of Mr. Volkov's townhouse, as they loaded him into an unmarked van with his hands cupped behind his back. And I waited for some sense of satisfaction, some feeling of justice served. But all I felt was loss, and the next 6 months were a blur of safe houses and debriefings and preparing for trial. They moved me 4 times, different cities, different names, always with Marshal watching, always isolated. And I testified at the trial, sat in that courtroom, and told my story to a judge and jury while Mr. Volkov stared at me with those cold blue eyes. And I identified documents and photographs, confirmed conversations I'd overheard, and the prosecutor made me sound like a hero, this brave immigrant who'd risked everything for her adopted country. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who'd stumbled into something bigger than myself and barely survived. And Mr. Volkov was convicted, sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, and 5 other people were arrested based on the evidence found in his house, including Robert Hutchins from the Defense Department. And the media covered it for a few weeks, called it one of the biggest espionage cases of the decade, but they never mentioned my name because I was protected. I was a confidential witness. I was invisible again, but in a different way. And after the trial, Agent Morrison came to see me one last time, and he said, "You can come out of protection now if you want. The immediate threat is over. Volkov and his network are neutralized." And I asked, "Can I go back to my old life?" And he hesitated and then said, "You can go back to Arlington if you want. But everyone knows about the case. Even without your name being public, people will figure out who you are. And there's always some risk, not from the Soviets necessarily, but from sympathizers, from angry relatives of the people who were convicted." And I realized he was telling me that my old life was gone regardless, that even if I went back, it wouldn't be the same. I'd always be looking over my shoulder, always wondering if someone recognized me. And I'd lost touch with my sister. The marshals had sent her money for 6 months, but then the program ended, and I had no way to contact her safely. And I was 43 years old with no job, no references I could use, no identity beyond the fake one the marshals had created. And I had to decide who I was going to be, whether I'd stay in protection with my new name and try to build a new life in some anonymous city, or whether I'd reclaim my real name and face whatever consequences came with it. And this is the part where I wish I could tell you I made the heroic choice, that I stood tall and proud and lived openly. But the truth is I chose safety, chose anonymity, chose a small apartment in a city I'd never been to before where nobody knew Maria Castellanos or what she'd done. And I got a job cleaning houses again, because it's what I knew, what I was good at, and I started over. And it's been 40 years now, 40 years of living under a different name, and I still send money to my sister. Found a way to do it through an intermediary, so it can't be traced back to me. And she knows I'm alive, but not where I am. And sometimes I wonder if it was worth it. If stopping one spy network justified losing my identity, my family connection, my sense of self. And I don't have an easy answer to that question. Some days I think yes, absolutely, I did something important, something necessary. And other days I think about the cost, about the Maria Castellanos who died in that moment when I made that phone call, when I chose courage over safety, and I wonder if she'd make the same choice again. And the thing nobody tells you about being a whistleblower, about doing the right thing, is that the consequences don't end when the case closes. They ripple through your entire life. They change everything permanently, and you have to live with that, have to find a way to be okay with what you've lost. And I'm still working on that, still trying to make peace with the choice I made. And I'm telling you this story not because I want sympathy or recognition. I'm telling you because somebody needs to talk about the real cost of courage, about what happens after the news cameras leave, after the prosecutors move on to their next case, after everyone else is forgotten. And if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, doesn't always come with rewards or happy endings. Sometimes it just comes with a quiet knowledge that you couldn't have lived with yourself if you'd stayed silent. And that has to be enough. That has to sustain you through the lonely years and the second-guessing and the wondering what if. And I still clean houses, still move through wealthy people's homes invisible and unnoticed. But I'm not the same woman I was. I carry this secret history, this knowledge of what I did and what it cost me. And sometimes when I'm alone, I take out the newspaper clipping I saved from the trial, the one with a headline about the Soviet spy ring that was broken up, and I look at it and try to remember who I was, try to feel some pride. And mostly I just feel tired and old and invisible in a way that goes deeper than just being a cleaning lady. I'm invisible to history. My contribution will never be in textbooks. My name will never be remembered. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the truest heroes are the ones nobody knows about, the ones who sacrifice everything and get nothing but the private knowledge that they did what needed to be done. So now you know my story. You know what happened to the maid who found hidden rubles and called the FBI. You know about surveillance and the danger and the trial and the aftermath. And you know that 40 years later, I'm still living with the consequences of that choice. Still wondering if it was worth it. Still trying to reconcile the woman I was with the woman I became. And if you're ever faced with a similar choice, if you ever discover something you're not supposed to know, something dangerous, something that demands action, I can't tell you what to do. I can only tell you that whatever you choose will change you, will cost you something. And you need to decide whether you can live with silence or whether you can live with the price of speaking up. And for me, on my best days, I think I made the right choice. I think Maria Castellanos would be proud of what I did even if nobody else knows to be proud. And on my worst days, I wonder if one person's courage really matters in the grand scheme of things. If my sacrifice made any real difference. And I guess I'll never know for sure. But I do know this. I couldn't have lived with staying silent. Couldn't have gone back to that house and pretended I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Couldn't have been complicit through inaction. So, maybe it wasn't really a choice at all. Maybe it was just who I am, who my husband raised me to be. Someone who can ignore evil even when ignoring it will be safer, easier, smarter. And if that makes me foolish, then I'm foolish. But at least I'm foolish with a clear conscience. At least I can look at myself in the mirror and know that when it mattered, when it counted, I chose the harder right over the easier wrong. And that's going to have to be enough. That's going to have to sustain me. Through whatever years I have left, this quiet knowledge that once, long ago, an invisible woman saw something and refused to stay silent. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Just refuse to stay silent when silence would be complicity. Refuse to look away when looking away would be easier. And accept whatever consequences come from that refusal. And live with them. And try to find meaning in them. And hope that somewhere, somehow, it mattered